What's up guys, Jeff from Sorta Healthy here. Today we'll be talking about exercises that I avoid with personal training clients. When trainers get into the field, one thing they almost always do is train clients similarly to how they would train themselves. This isn't always a bad thing, but sometimes this can lead to unnecessary client injuries. If you're watching this video now, physically, you probably have very little in common with the average personal training client. You're probably relatively young, most likely you're in your 20s or 30s. You might be a little bit older than that, but it doesn't really matter too much. You're probably relatively fit and healthy, and possibly most importantly, you probably somewhat enjoy working out, and most likely you've been physically active for a good chunk of time. The average personal training client is over 40, they're overweight, fairly unhealthy, and they usually aren't too physically active. Of course, that is why they're hiring you. Considering the differences between you and your clients, I think it's fairly obvious to see why your workouts should look a little bit different. On that note, let's start talking about some differences between a typical personal training session and your own workout. Some of the exercises that we're about to break down may be great in your own workout, but they would be iffy for most of your clients. All I ask before we get into all of that is that you consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. This is the best way to support this channel, which is a free resource for all fitness professionals. Thank you so much for that support, everyone. On to the rest of the video. The first exercise that I avoid with clients, and unlike some of the other moves on this list, I don't do these myself as well, is the upright row. The upright row involves elevation and internal rotation of the shoulder. Most of your clients, really just most people in general, well, they're already way too internally rotated at the shoulder as it is. This in part gives them this rounded forward appearance. When you force someone who is already internally rotated to internally rotate even more and then elevate like this, it's a recipe for disaster. Essentially what happens when you do this is over time these little rotator cuff muscles, your biceps tendon, and some other things that live in this space, well, they get slowly frayed over time like a rope rubbing against a sharp edge. Some people can get away with doing this for a long time, and others don't get so lucky. Even with form modifications, this exercise still presents the same issue. So basically my stance on this exercise is just don't do it at all if you care about your long-term shoulder health. That applies to you and your clients as well. The upright row is primarily used as a deltoid and trapezius strengthener or builder. Honestly though, there are better exercises for both muscle groups. For the deltoids, controlled overhead presses are your best bet. Even exercises like the lateral raise, when performed properly, again, not internally rotating or raising too high, have their place. As far as building the traps is concerned, rows, face pulls, rack pulls, and reverse fly variations should be some of your go-tos. The next exercise that I avoid with my personal training clients are box jumps. Unlike the upright rows that we just talked about, box jumps are actually a good and useful exercise. On the rare occasion that I get a younger athlete client, I will consider putting box jumps or something similar into their routine. The box jump, as well as other similar movements, are good at building explosive lower body strength after all. This all being said, the risk to reward ratio isn't very favorable for average clients when we're talking about this exercise. Simply put, there is just a lot that can go wrong. The most obvious thing is that the client just fails to make it onto the box. If you have a client who fails to land on the box when attempting a box jump, obviously that client is going to end up hurt, which is just bad. We don't want to hurt people. And also, you think you're going to be able to sign that client back on when it's time to renew their package? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. It certainly doesn't help your odds though. Even if you knew your client was going to land on that box every time, there still is an increased risk with any movement that's that explosive. Again, when we're dealing with a typical personal training client, we're dealing with a person who isn't too physically active, and they most likely have orthopedic issues or at the very least muscle imbalances. If a client does have any lower body orthopedic issues, a knee, ankle, or hip injury would be the most likely suspects. Don't have them do any explosive jumping movements. If they don't have any lower body injuries, they're on the younger side, and it supports their goals, plyometric exercises like the box jump could have a place in a client's routine. Make sure your client has mastered the basics before you do any plyometric work with them. In the box jumps case, make sure your client knows how to squat properly as well as land before attempting anything more explosive. Also, start with a low landing surface and slowly add height. Again, I don't do this exercise with any of my clients, but for some of you, it may make sense to have this one in the mix. The third exercise that I avoid with my clients is the squat on the Smith machine. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that squats on the Smith machine are all bad. Over at Renaissance Periodization, they showed how you can properly do these to achieve some extra quad strengthening benefits without getting hurt. And I'll leave a link to that video down in the description for those who are interested. This all being said, most of your clients would be far better off doing different exercises instead of squatting on the Smith machine. When you squat on a Smith machine, your stabilizing muscles don't activate anywhere near as much as they would with a typical barbell or dumbbell squat. A 2009 study study showed 43% more muscle activation with free weight squats compared to Smith machine squats. A bigger problem than the reduced muscle activation from most clients would be the Smith machine's effect on overall movement patterns. If you're incorporating Smith machine squats into your clients' workouts often, that can definitely change the way they move. Most clients are already too quad dominant with underactive glutes. Smith machine squats would only worsen that issue. Also, most personal training clients aren't doing any additional weighted squatting outside of your sessions with them. You don't want them getting too used to the assistance that a Smith machine provides, because that can in all likelihood lead to compensatory issues down the road. If you choose to incorporate these Smith machine squats, it should be a very occasional thing in my opinion. Better options for almost any training client would be lunge variations, Bulgarian split squats, or even just different forms of free weight squats. The next exercise that I don't do with my personal training clients is sprinting. This to me is very similar to box jumps because sprinting is great. It's just not that great for the average personal training client. Average everyday people have all kinds of physical limitations. Some of these things will be very obvious to your clients themselves as well as you, their trainer. Other physical limitations will be a little bit tougher to uncover. One physical issue that most of your clients will have is an anterior pelvic tilt. Having too great of an anterior pelvic tilt can cause a whole bunch of problems. One thing it encourages is too much lumbar lordosis or too great of a lordotic curve, which looks like this. In this position, the abdominals are in a weakened state and the low back is often a source of pain or discomfort. It can also lead to a more kyphotic posture, or this, which can cause a bunch of issues too. When we're specifically talking about sprinting and average personal training clients, we really have to be concerned about what's going on with the lower body musculature. When a client has too much anterior pelvic tilting going on, the hip flexors and quads become tight and shortened, and the hamstrings and glutes become lengthened, weakened, and tight in what is often called a locked long position. The hamstrings in particular live in this constant state of being overstretched because they attach here and here. You fix this stuff, or an excessive anterior pelvic tilt, by stretching out the hip flexors, strengthening the core, and also strengthening the glutes and hamstrings. People have a tendency to want to stretch their hamstrings when all this is going on. Remember though, they're tight because they're overstretched, not understretched. They're taut like a rubber band pulled to the max. When you tell someone with all of this going on to sprint, there is really just so much that can go wrong. The most common injury would be a hamstring pull since they're too weak and over-lengthened. Also, the glutes, which are supposed to be helping with hip extension, well, they're most likely underactive because they're being sat on too much. Really though, most of this problem does revolve around people spending too much time sitting. So orthopedically, sprinting makes very little sense to do with most of your training clients. And we haven't even talked about sprinting form or anything like that, and that's tough enough to master as it is. The only clients you should consider doing sprinting exercises with, in my opinion, are younger athletes. For everyone else, cardio interval work can be beneficial, but I would keep the intensity a fair amount lower than full-on sprinting. The next exercise that I don't do with my personal training clients, and you should probably consider the same thing with your clients, are the Olympic lifts. Whether we're talking about cleans, jerks, snatches, or anything else, these lifts just really aren't appropriate for average, everyday people. For one, the movements themselves are just far more complicated than other resistance training exercises. Most people want to become more active, but they don't typically have the patience or will to put in the hours of work necessary to become more skilled at these lifts. Also, with how explosive these movements are, the margin of error that you can get away with here is much smaller than it is with most other exercises. If I have a client doing a dumbbell row 95% correct, the odds of them getting injured is pretty low. Obviously, I'd like to get them even closer to 100% over time, but if we're being careful, not everything has to be 100% perfect to make progress. We have to be close to perfect, but there is an acceptable degree of error. That acceptable degree of error is far smaller for the Olympic lifts. If I have a client doing a snatch, I'm not nearly as confident that we can safely get away with near perfect form. So if Olympic lifts are cool to you, they could certainly have a place in your own workouts. Think really carefully before attempting them with clients though. The last thing that we'll talk about today are kettlebell exercises. Really, it's only certain kettlebell exercises that we should be concerned about. Before anything else, let me be clear that I really like some kettlebell exercises. In fact, the kettlebell swing is one of my favorites, and I perform some pretty much every week. This all being said, there are a good number of kettlebell exercises that you should be extra cautious with when working with clients. Any exercises where you're dealing with increased amounts of momentum like standard swings, one-arm swings, figure eights, etc., well, these should all be treated with extra care. Unlike Olympic lifts and a lot of the other things we talked about today, I do actually have a fair number of my clients perform kettlebell exercises. Most kettlebell exercises aren't overly complicated, and many, like the swing, offer very solid benefits. So I really only avoid kettlebell exercises with some of my clients, probably about 50 to 60% of them, to be honest. For me to trust a client with a kettlebell kettlebell when we're talking about any type of swinging or momentum-based movement, that client has to be able to do a few things. One, they need to be able to hip hinge effectively while maintaining proper form and posture. I essentially use deadlift variations, especially Romanian deadlifts, to help clients master that. This means I've probably spent at least a few weeks working on other hip hinging moves before moving to kettlebell swings. Two, they need to have good core control. If a client can't tighten their core to brace their spine effectively, they don't get to swing a kettlebell. Make sure your clients have adequate core control and strength before doing kettlebell exercises. Three, they need to be able to fire their glutes on demand. We talked about this earlier in the video. Many clients have underactive glutes from spending too much time sitting. If clients lose that mind-muscle connection to their glutes, well, that could definitely cause a problem during certain kettlebell exercises like the swing. For me to trust a client with a kettlebell, I have to know that they can utilize that glute muscle tissue when it counts. You have to be able to contract your glutes to do these exercises properly. If I feel like a client doesn't have enough of a connection to their glute muscles to perform a kettlebell swing properly, I'll have them perform exercises like the bridge or hip thruster long before we try any swing movements. Like I said, at least half of my clients don't do any of these kettlebell specific movements because I'm not 100% sure they've mastered all these things. In my opinion, when it comes to stuff like this, it's always better to err on the side of caution. Of course, when I do introduce something like a kettlebell swing, we always start things off really light and work our way up from there as well. And that, my friends, is all that we have for today. Do you guys have any other exercises in mind that trainers should avoid when working with clients? Do you have any questions on anything that we went over today? Either way, make sure to let me know down below in the comments. And if you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel because it does help the channel to grow and it allows me to create more free content for all of you. Thanks for watching, everyone, and until next time, stay sorta healthy.